Okay, so let's just get right into it. Without a doubt, the single greatest extracurricular coming in S++ tier is, of course, donating a building. But on a more serious note, my name is David Lomelin. I'm a freshman at MIT, and over the past 4 years, I've gotten to really understand and know what makes or breaks an Ivy League level college application. And I've talked to dozens of students from every single Ivy school and top 10 school, including Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and of course, MIT. So this tier list is going to be specifically meant for people who are reaching to the stars and really want to get into the best schools in the world. And this means that I'm going to be extremely harsh in this video, and I'm going to be ranking popular extracurriculars very low on the list. So with that out of the way, let's actually dive into the tier list. Okay, so I'm going to quickly explain the tiers before I actually get started with any of the rankings. So firstly, the tier at the bottom is going to be waste of time. There are a lot of extracurriculars that have a preconception of being very, very good for college, but in reality, they're just a huge waste of time, and I would just not recommend them. Right above that is going to be the average tier. So now these are going to be the extracurriculars that maybe your average high school student might have. These are not the best for Ivy League level schools, but again, they're better than having nothing. Right above that is going to be above average. As the name implies, these are going to be the ECs that are just slightly above average. Again, these by themselves are not going to get you into an Ivy League or into an MIT, but they definitely do add to a more cohesive application. So on top of that is going to be the top 1% of students. Now, these are the extracurriculars that very, very few people can actually manage to get. And if you can get even one or two of these extracurriculars, you're going to have a huge shot at a top school. And the last tier is going to be Ivy or MIT acceptance. And this is going to be the tier of extracurriculars that I've seen people have who consistently get into top schools. And there's only going to be 3 in this category, and I'm going to tell you why as I go on. But just be aware that if you have any of these on your application, then you have a very high chance of making a top school. So before I really get started, I do want to say, even if I am going to rank many things very low, that should not stop you from pursuing that if you have a real passion. Because one of the main things that colleges look for is having real passion. So even if you're not very good at maybe coding, or you're not very good at a sport or a musical instrument, but you really, really love the process in doing it, then by all means, keep on doing it. This tier list should have no effect on what you really like. But just overall, this tier list is going to be based more off of what I've seen be successful in college applications. But again, if you're really passionate for something, don't let this stray you away. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's actually go ahead and get started with the ranking. So the first thing I'm going to rank is DECA, HOSA, and FBLA, and sort of any state level clubs. Honestly, I'm thinking of putting this, honestly, an average. The large majority of people who are in these types of clubs are mostly doing it for participation. And the issue with that is that colleges don't really want to see just participation. They want to see some sort of impact you've had maybe on the team, or maybe you doing very, very well on FBLA. And statistically, that's just not most students. Most students who are in these clubs just do it for participation, or they do it for fun, and they're not really on that next level that top colleges are looking for. Okay, next up, I have student government. I do think that unless you are looking into political science or something in that matter, that it's honestly just a waste of time. Because the reality is that the large majority, again, not all, but the large majority of student governments maybe hold a few events a year and maybe do a couple of leadership activities, but beyond that, there's not really a whole lot to be found there. And colleges know this, and they know that student governments are not the most difficult thing to do, and a lot of the times it can be a much more passive extracurricular and are not necessarily a way to differentiate yourself from every other applicant. And again, this doesn't go with the strategy of trying to do something different or be the best at something. It's just sort of a more passive extracurricular. Okay, next up, I have musical instruments, and this includes anything like choir, band, or anything in that realm. Again, I do think this is a waste of time, and it follows a similar logic of student governments, where there's a lot of people playing musical instruments, and it's very, very difficult to get to that next national or international level that top colleges are really looking for. So again, if you're the 1 in a million exception and you're playing at a very top level, I would not recommend putting in band, just because it's so much time commitment. You're doing maybe 3 or 4 hours or more a day into practice, and the reality is that so many students are in band. It's a very, very common extracurricular. Okay, next up, I have varsity sports. I do think varsity sports are an above average extracurricular, even though there are a lot of people who do varsity sports, and the large majority of them don't get into top colleges. If you do the correct strategy with varsity sports, it can actually provide you a huge advantage to top colleges, especially the likes of Harvard and MIT. So a secret that a lot of people don't know is that MIT and Harvard are huge on rowing. And if you pick a more niche sport such as rowing or maybe field hockey, and you play at a high level, which is relatively realistic to do, then it can give you a big step up compared to other applicants. But again, it really depends on your strategy. If you're playing a sport like football or basketball, I know a single student who got into Harvard playing football, but apart from that, it's very, very rare to get into these top schools through more common sports like that. So if you are playing a more common sport, honestly, I would put this at above average or waste of time. But if you are strategizing well, this is easily top 1% of students, or even IB/MIT acceptance. But to even it out, I'm just going to put it at above average. Okay, next up, I have Honor Society. And this should honestly come as no shock to any of you, but this is absolutely a huge waste of time. It's just because so many students are in these honor societies. And again, a lot of them require a certain amount of volunteer hours or a certain amount of work to be done. And honestly, it's just a waste of time. So many students have this in their application, and you're just sort of tacking it on by spending hours and hours into an honor society. I will say that if you have a high leadership position or you just really like the community, then of course it's a good idea to stay within the honor society because it's a good community and provides good support. But strictly as an extracurricular for top colleges, it's just not the best choice. Okay, next up, I have a research internship. And honestly, I would consider putting this at top 1% of students, just because getting any sort of research, whether it be by yourself or with a faculty, especially published research, is extremely, extremely powerful in any application. Because it goes to show you know a technical realm well enough to do research and actually push the boundaries a little bit. And honestly, this can take many, many years of trial and error and learning everything that you need. But if you are able to push out a paper, any form of research, that's going to put you above 99% of students who haven't taken that initiative. So this is easily a top 1% of students' activity. Okay, next up, I have company internships. And honestly, even though it might seem very impressive at first to get an internship at Google or Microsoft, the harsh reality is that a lot of colleges think that these internships are going to be acquired through either family or direct connections or some unfair way that other students might not be able to acquire the same internships. So the internships alone are not the greatest piece of extracurriculars, but if you are able to develop a really cool project or do something cool within that internship, then that can actually boost your application quite a bit. Overall, I'm just gonna put company internships at above average, but it really depends what you do within that internship that matters. Next up, I have college courses. So of course, if you have DE or AP courses available within your school, you need to take them for a top college, as your courses and GPA are sort of the base of what colleges look at, and then they'll look at your extracurriculars afterward. However, if you're taking a DE course or self-studying for an AP test or doing anything like that, the reality is that colleges just don't care, especially top ones. Because with that same time, you could be doing really cool research projects, or maybe starting a business or a nonprofit or a million other things. And more often than not, DE courses or self-studying for AP tests are just a big waste of time. So for that reason, they're going in the waste of time tier. Okay, next up, I have mission trips. Now, this is gonna be a little bit controversial, but in my opinion, if you're spending $5,000 or $10,000 to go to Africa, clean up some trash, and spend the rest of it in your hotel room, colleges are not gonna love that. If you are going out and making real change, maybe building homes, or giving resources, or building wells, or doing something real, then that can be extremely, extremely valuable. And in that case, this could easily go in the top 1% of students. But the large majority of mission trips are just sort of fake vacations where they maybe clean up some trash and just call it a day. So overall, it is a big waste of time. Next up, I have Olympiads and science fairs, and I'm gonna group them together. Just going to a math Olympiad or an international science competition or anything of that matter is extremely, extremely valuable in any college application, even if you don't necessarily place or do very well in it. So the reason for this is because it shows you built some sort of research, or you studied for a math Olympiad, or you prepared very, very hard for a competition. If you do go on to place or even win any of these competitions, that is automatically a green flag for top colleges. So easily, Olympiads and science fairs are gonna go into the IB and MIT acceptance, especially if you win or place in any of these. And these are some of the most common extracurriculars I've seen from students, especially at MIT, where MIT loves students who do well in these competitions. Next up, I have speech and debate and model UN, which I am going to group together. If you're not competing at a very high, maybe state or national level, or you have any sort of opposite position, honestly, this is just a very average extracurricular. The reality is that so many students are just doing debate or model UN in some form or another. And you're not going to make yourself stand out or be different just by saying that you participated in some of these clubs. So you have to take the step above to make it worth your while. But overall, speech and debate and model UN are not my favorite extracurriculars. Okay, next up, I have the Olympics, or any sort of very, very high level athleticism. This is, again, so easily going into IB and MIT acceptance. If you're doing anything on a national and especially international scale, and you're competing, regardless of whether or not you place, it's just such a unique skill to do anything on that level that MIT and the IBs really, really look out for unique people like that. Again, I know very, very few students are actually on the Olympic level, but if you are a student who is competing at that level, then congrats, that is one of the best things for your application. Next up, I have founding a business. I do think that this is a very much a top 1% of student activity, especially if you are able to bring some revenue in. If you're not, just making a business is one of the best learning opportunities anyone can ever take. And even if you completely fail and make maybe $20 instead of your $1 million dream, the amount you'll learn from making and failing a business is such a valuable piece of information, regardless of whether it's successful or a failure, that this is easily a top 1% of student activity. If you go on to make a very successful company, maybe sell it off or have a large valuation or have a lot of revenue coming in, this can actually boost up to an IB or MIT acceptance level. But for most businesses who will be at least somewhat successful, this is a top 1% of students activity. Next up, I have Robotics Club. And I'm going to be honest, I am very biased towards robotics because I did robotics for 2 or 3 years and I absolutely loved it. But the harsh reality is that it's such a huge time commitment. It can be 5 to 6 hours a day. And a lot of the times the competitions are very luck-based. And unless you get to a state level placement or even a world's placement, that most of the time it's just not worth it. But personally, I love doing robotics. I learned so much from doing it. Usually I would probably put robotics in average. But because I'm biased, I'm going to throw it in above average. And I highly recommend to at least try out robotics, maybe make some new friends and learn a whole lot on the way. Okay, next up, I have volunteering. Without a doubt, this is a waste of time. The issue is that a lot of students volunteer for the sake of volunteering, and they want to get maybe 100 hours or 200 volunteer hours to put on their college applications. But again, colleges just don't care. Okay, next up, I have Boy Scouts. I'm going to put Boy Scouts in average. The main issue with Boy Scouts is that it takes many, many years and many, many hours of dedication to get to the Eagle Scout position, which is sort of the gold standard position for these Boy Scouts. Unless you're very passionate for Boy Scouts, I would not recommend you spend so much time on it. The reality is that a lot of students have Boy Scouts within their application, and it's not anything new or unique that colleges haven't seen before. Next up, I have subject clubs. I do think that subject clubs like math clubs or science clubs or computer science clubs are generally a big waste of time for these top schools. But I do want to say that more often than not, these can be some of the best clubs in all of high school. I ran my school's computer science club for 2 years, and I learned so much about leadership and getting things done on time that honestly, I would not really consider it a waste of time, even though it is in the waste of time tier. Colleges don't really care too much about these individual clubs, but if you are in some sort of leader or maybe your club has had some sort of big impact, then of course this can climb up a few tiers. But generally, I would stray away from joining as many clubs as you possibly can in high school and just focusing on maybe 2 or 3 really high quality extracurriculars. Lastly, I have school newspaper. I think a school newspaper is fine. It's average. It largely depends what major you're trying to go into and what sort of story you want to develop around your application. But again, school newspapers, it's a very common thing that a lot of students get into. It's not a very high skill extracurricular. And it's not unique enough for colleges to really be impressed by at a high school newspaper. Okay, so that's my tier list for every single high school extracurricular. If I miss any extracurriculars or you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I do my best to answer every single comment, so if you leave any question, I'll be sure to answer it. And if you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Every subscription really means a lot to me. And that pretty much wraps up the video.